Russia today is the most insecure that it's been in 300 years in terms of geographic boundaries. And so it's no surprise that a government such as Vladimir Putin's is taking a harsher line with dissidents. And Russia moving forward has two problems, one midterm, one short term. The midterm problem is demographic. Russia is one of the least healthy demographies in the world. It's one of the fastest aging in the world. And even if you believe Russian statistics, and they just keep making up millions of children that they shove into the demographic data, which is, just hilarious, I personally find. But the bottom line is that Russia is one of the most insecure nations in human history. And in the roughly 800-year history of the Russian people, it's just been the story of invasion one after the other. Russia proper, forget kind of the near broad area. Russia proper has absolutely no barriers separating it from its neighbors. There are 11 major invasion routes. All of them have been used multiple times in their history. And the primary reason that the Russians are always so damn paranoid is because they're actually aware of their own history. It's not an unwise position. Now, we can all argue over whether or not the world has changed or whether or not a different policy at a different time would have generated a different result. Those are all legitimate conversations to have. But the bottom line is that Russia is one of the most insecure nations in human history.
They're losing access to global markets because of sanctions and the war. A lot of them have shut down. The last time this happened, it was 1992, and it took the Russians 30 years to bring it all back online. They only finished last December. So we could have Latvia grab one oil tanker and this all just stops. 5 million barrels a day. They're losing access to global markets because of sanctions and the war. A lot of them have shut down.
And in the roughly 800-year history of the Russian people, it's just been the story of invasion one after the other. In addition, the climate patterns, not just the fact that it's a cold place, but the erratic nature of the jet stream as it goes over Russia means that they get floods and they get droughts. And there is no such thing as an average agricultural year. And that grinds on you. And simply ruling something like this, where the year in, year out challenges are so big from a security point of view and a financial point of view and a transport point of view and an agricultural point of view, it's no shock that this is not a land that is particularly fertile for democracy. So what do? You expand until you can build up a series of subject nations that are cannon fodder to fend off invasions, until you eventually reach barriers like the Alma-Ata Mountains or the Carpathians that you can kind of hunker behind. And the reason that the Soviet Union was a superpower is because they were able to do that in the closing days of World War II. And they were able to actually form a hard shell in a way that the Russians had never experienced before. That was piece one. Piece two, ironically, was the global order. Because when the Americans broke up all the empires, that included all the empires that had traditionally gone to war with Russia, whether it was Japan or Britain or Germany or whatever else. So the Russians found themselves in the most secure environment they had ever been in their history. And with the exception of the Americans, everyone else was under lockdown strategically. The Americans didn't allow any of their allies to stir up trouble in Russia because they didn't want to have a broad-scale conflict. That lasted until 1992, which of course is when the economic fallacies of the communist system eventually broke loose and crushed the entire system.
And these are just two things that are happening right now. When you remove the Americans from maintaining the globalized system, you're going to have that in a lot more places. What's going on in China isn't just going to be about health, it's going to be political. What's going on in Russia isn't just going to be security, it's going to be demographic. And all of these things combined make multi-step supply chains, especially in the Asian space, impossible to maintain. So we are going to have to rebuild industry without them in North America.
I don't want to say that this is the end of the Russian state, but I've always said that this is the last generation of the Russian state. So the question now is, with a health crisis, with a budget crisis, and with a security crisis, anyone who looks at Russian economics and tries to compare them to any other country, in my opinion, is kind of looking at it the wrong way. Russia has never been an efficient economy. It has never been particularly value added. And the Russian government is always willing to make the population suffer in the name of security. And most Russians agree to that bargain. Life is so insecure in Russia, historically speaking, and honestly within living memory. The 2007 to 2009 crisis was awful. The 1990s were just retching. The 1970s, the high point of the Soviet Union is not perceived that way in Russia because the Brezhnev years were awful.